Listen, if you're not willing to accept me when this is my microphone quality, you don't deserve me. What's up, gamers? Welcome back to another corner of the internet where a female impersonator you don't care about talks about some autistic bullshit for 20 minutes and then disappears for a month. I'm a visionary of unique and original innovation. I have autism, and one of the major symptoms of this terrible illness is caring about the Doctor Who franchise. I used to cry myself to sleep over not being born into a fictional universe where a skinny British man is frequently the Earth's only hope of survival. I wonder why I had trouble making friends as a kid. Anyway, autism, am I right? That's what this video is about, let's get into it. The Doctor is autistic. This video is about the 12th Doctor, not because he is the most relevant to the points I would like to make or because he's the most autistic, but because he's my favourite, and I want to put him in a lunchbox before proceeding to violently shake it. Because his particular run is my favourite, however, it is a piece of television that I have zero discomfort around affectionately tearing to shreds, and despite my love for it, it's far from perfect. Today I would like to unpack some key aspects of his characterization that I both find fascinating, inspiring, and potentially a little problematic, but we'll get to that. Seeing the Doctor as autistic is obviously a subjective interpretation by all technical reason. I'm right, but I must maintain the pretense of subjectivity so as not to deter viewership. This is totally my subjective opinion, yes. I will not really be trying to change the minds of anyone who doesn't agree with this perspective. Rather, I will be analysing the implications of it and noting the pros and cons of how the Doctor's autistic traits interact with the narrative and frame him as a character. But what are those traits exactly? If you're not autistic, one, I don't know why you're watching this, but thanks for the attention, and two, there's a good chance you won't automatically pick up on accidental autistic coding in fiction despite it being very common. And yes, I do pretty much believe that the Doctor's autistic coding is accidental and more a product of writers attempting to make just a weird and wacky character without a very good understanding of neurodivergent people, than any intentional implications or social commentary. But that social commentary exists nonetheless, and so does an autistic audience for this show, and we're gonna pick up on it. Creative intent is not irrelevant, but for the sake of this video and the points I want to make, whether or not writers intended to portray autism isn't really the issue at hand. The fact that this coding was most likely accidental arguably gives us more to discuss around the implicit biases at play in the writer's room, and how they manifest through an attempt at a weird character just coming out autistic as hell. Allow me to explain my reasoning as to why I believe the 12th Doctor oozes autism from his pores like a conservative politician oozes sweat when asked if he's ever made a woman climax. Without a doubt, the Doctor is, at least on the surface, a comedic character. They are consistently portrayed as a quirky nerd with little care for performative human politeness or social decencies. This character trait is pretty much exclusively a source of comedy, and in many iterations it is clearly meant to be a result of the fact that they're an alien.
Parents' evening!
Humans.
By all rational understanding, we would assume that a character who has spent more time on Earth around humans than the average human lifespan would have a pretty exceptional understanding of human behavior. So when the Doctor is so often shown to not have this understanding even slightly, we can reasonably gather that it is for the sake of comedy. An issue that is prominent specifically within the Matt Smith and David Tennant's Doctor's seasons is that the characterization of the Doctor often contradicts itself. More specifically, it contradicts things established in previous eras in what feels like just a failed attempt at superficial imitation without care or understanding. Showrunner Stephen Moffat is seemingly unsure of whether they're a character who doesn't care about being seen as strange, or whether they're a character who is failing to appear normal unintentionally. This unsure approach to writing the perceived strange aspects of their character can prove quite detrimental to anyone wishing to analyze or understand them on a level that's not explicitly explored or spelled out in the series itself, and it's been a fucking nightmare for me to try and gather coherent points around a character trait that so often feels like hardly any care has been put into it whatsoever. Any exploration of the contradictions the Doctor shows at multiple points with their relationship with social norms are sidelined by the narrative, and the writers frequently fail to address them beyond surface-level throwaway jokes. Whenever the narrative calls for the Doctor to convincingly blend in with a culture, the story acts like it expects us to just forget about the fact that they apparently are still the same character who doesn't fucking know what football is.
Now, football's the one with the sticks, isn't it?
And accept that any example of the Doctor failing to adhere to social norms is only something that happens when it's convenient. There's a major issue with this in the fact that there are people who act the way the Doctor does during these comedic scenes, who, as far as I can tell, aren't actually aliens. In the real world, many of these behaviors are not present merely as a way to evoke laughter in the neurotypical, but are truly just the behaviors of a neurodivergent person living their life. Representing neurodivergent behavior that rarely extends further than being a source of amusement at the expense of the neurodivergent character, and then completely failing to explore any of their neurodivergent traits in any meaningful way, all the while sidelining said traits completely and pretending they never existed when the plot calls for it, has real impact on both neurodivergent people watching and neurotypical people who are subconsciously taking on board everything they're being shown. 12 is a little different to his two predecessors in this regard, as his neurodivergence, while definitely being played up mostly for laughs, remains completely consistent. Even in instances where he's shown to pick up on certain unexpected social cues, for example when he notices Clara and Danny's relationship but chooses not to show it, this is clearly framed as a way to portray one of the many ways Clara underestimates him. And the show actually acknowledges that him noticing is surprising to both Clara and the audience. To me, 12 shows an improved awareness of how different aspects of the Doctor's character can interact without being antithetical to each other, and a willingness to commit to his neurodivergence and work around the supposed narrative inconvenience it might cause. Improvement doesn't mean perfection, however, and my credit can't really go much further than they got slightly better at making a key trait of this main character not confusing and inconsistent as shit. Seeing as this autistic coding is still played pretty aggressively for laughs, it's an improvement in that the Doctor's autism isn't exclusively confined to comedic scenes, absolutely, but it definitely still primarily exists to serve those scenes. Traits that manifest themselves through this weird man does weird thing type of comedy, but are also just literal autism, like straight up written in the official diagnostic criteria for autism, include 12's bluntness and inability to read social cues.
I would say that person would be an egomaniac, needy game player.
His accidental rudeness, his strong sense of justice and moral code, juxtaposed by his indifference towards his image and little care towards seeming nice.
That's the Doctor for you. Never notices the tears.
His struggles with effective communication.
I just felt that I had to say something.
I know, and I appreciated it.
Because I've got a duty of care.
Which you take very seriously, I know.
So can I stop now?
Please do.
His discomfort around emotional vulnerability, his dislike of being touched, which the show questionably frames as a character flaw he kind of has to learn to overcome, and his perceived tastelessness in situations where most would default towards comfort and compassion, for example, literally whenever he's around a grieving person and tries to facts and logic them out of being sad.
I'm very sorry for your loss. I'll do all I can to solve the death of your friend / family member / pet.
Traits that could be further interpreted as autistic coding but that aren't really played for comedy include his intense hyper-empathy, as well as his reluctance towards emotional vulnerability. There is an extremely common trend in media of comedic characters having either accidental or intentional heavy autistic coding. To a non-autistic person with little knowledge about autism, autistic behaviors will often fail to be recognized as such, which leads to said behaviors usually being interpreted as just weird quirkiness at first glance. If you don't know what to label a sense of other as, your brain will just file it away as either fantastical wackiness or sinister degeneracy depending on how open-minded you are. I think most relatively well-adjusted people these days understand that it's wrong to make fun of someone for being autistic explicitly, or at the very least recognize that it's widely looked down upon. However, the lack of education around autism and what it actually looks like means we're kind of just stuck in this state of laughing at autism without realizing that's what we're laughing at because no one calls it autism. Autistic people are a minority, and therefore are not in control of the media that portrays us, and when that media is instead controlled by probably well-meaning people who could only identify the behavior of autistic people as simply the universal antithesis to what's normal and socially acceptable, and therefore find us a completely acceptable and endless source of overdone comedy, this leads to autistic people feeling incredibly isolated and misunderstood, afraid of expressing traits or behaviors innate to us because they've only ever been shown to us as an unquestioned magnet for ridicule. Our options are somewhat limited, however. Genuinely positive autistic representation is incredibly rare, and autistic people will often latch onto these comedic characters for their relatability, despite the questionable implications of their existence, claiming them for the community through headcanons and fanwork. Reclamation of comic relief in pop culture has seemingly become a large part of autistic culture due to this, but it's not without backlash. I myself have been witness to several infuriating vomits of discourse surrounding whether or not certain characters are autistic, and the opposing argument usually boils down to they're not autistic because intentional portrayal of autism in mainstream pop culture is preposterous to me. And if I'm being honest, yeah, they kind of do have a point. There is no doubt that a heavy majority of characters with this kind of implicit coding were not intentionally written as autistic. They were written as weird, and often as undesirable. And to a writer whose mind has been bombarded with subtly ableist rhetoric for years, weirdness and undesirability can coincidentally look a lot like autism. There is no doubt that people love to laugh at autism. You can tell me you're not ableist as many times as you like, but autistic behavior is inseparable from comedy in our culture. Autistic people are constantly being humiliated and infantilized, being framed as immature and irrational, having our autonomy stripped from us, being incessantly desexualized to the point where some people genuinely believe we're unable to consent to sex, and we're not being subjected to autism mums posting videos of our distress without our consent as faux activism. We are being laughed at by our peers, only to be nervously apologized to once we actually call ourselves autistic and establish ourselves as off-limits through a label. These issues are most present in people who consider themselves our allies, too. I'm not even accounting for the large percentage of the population that will just straight up call us slurs or treat us with violence. So there we have it. The disbelief towards autistic interpretations of characters can be attributed mainly to a lack of faith in big production companies to care about autistic representation due to a widespread cultural narrative that sees and presents us as inferior and burdensome. But actually never mind, because there's a few more reasons and I lied. In fact, I believe it's big old soup of combined factors all festering together in their collective filth, marinating eternally in the big bubbling chasm of hot takes and unidentified fluids that is Tumblr discourse. A lot of the time, however, it can be narrowed down to one of two categories. 1. The character in question is portrayed as an object of desire. They are popular, well-liked, and a fan favorite, and non-autistic fans believe that reading them as autistic is a threat to their badass status, because having autism is such a beta soy boy move. For example, Wednesday Addams from that Netflix show where they were somehow seemingly afraid of making the Addams family too camp and had a horrendous conversion therapy metaphor that it was an L in every capacity. 2. The character is a comic relief character. They are unattractive, nerdy, socially inept, and we as an audience are clearly encouraged to laugh at them. Interpreting them as autistic then becomes an issue for non-autistic fans who find themselves forced to confront the fact that things they were laughing at can very easily be attributed to a marginalized community they see as off-limits. These are the two genders. Pack it up, liberals. While these two circumstances seem as if they are diametrically opposed, I do believe that they are adequate simplifications of the major motives behind "I don't like that you think this guy has autism." In my experience, people are perfectly comfortable laughing at something they perceive to be other until they are threatened with the potential to be labeled within a category seen as problematic. Their aversion to being seen as someone who laughs at autism does not come from a desire to be compassionate towards the strange, but from their fear of being tagged under the general essentialist umbrella of ableist or bigoted. This is why a being they previously viewed as a personification of mockery, being autistic, is such a threat to the delicate balancing act, feebly holding up the curtain separating mainstream comedy and ableism. It forces us to challenge the things that make us laugh by facing us with the people who are less amused. This is radical, and I fully encourage it, and it's a big reason why I care so much about autistic representations in media. I love to stir the pot, get a little problematic on Maine and piss off internet users by saying that Carlos the Scientist definitely has NPD, and you can fight me on this. This is the second video in a row where I've made a Welcome to Night Vale reference. I need to chill before one of you figures out that I'm Returning back to the 12th Doctor. Here's a particularly interesting case of this vague yet charming, probably ableist pop culture autism. He is the direct regeneration of the Matt Smith Doctor, a character who, while having plenty of the autistic traits that remain recognizable in 12, is at multiple points teased as a love interest and presented as much more charismatic and desirable. This plays heavily into the emotional conflict of the first episode of Season 8, Deep Breath, which essentially focuses around the fact that he's no longer young and hot, and how that affects his character relationships, particularly his relationship with Clara. This storyline creates quite a large dilemma almost immediately, basing its entire premise off the assumed preconceived belief of the audience that Peter Capaldi is less attractive than Matt Smith, which somewhat breaks the immersion of any audience members who happen to have eyes. Despite this obvious flaw, this episode is incredibly fascinating to me, as well as relevant to my interpretation of 12 as autism incarnate. The episode places 12's autistic traits as a direct parallel to his undesirability, and presents us with traits previously unseen in 11, that are less quirky and charming and or funny, but are nonetheless still traits that real autistic people possess. 12 explicitly contrasts with 11 in his cold and blunt demeanor, his inability to convincingly express empathy, his social obliviousness and sigma male mindset, and this change is specifically only addressed within the lens of how it affects Clara and her view of him. The episode follows Clara grappling with the unfamiliarity of the new Doctor after having implied romantic feelings for 11 when he was young and charismatic, navigating the conflicted feelings and discomfort she's experiencing as a result of seeing her time hunk get reincarnated into an old autistic Scottish man, and ultimately concludes in her being wrong in treating him with distrust, but with any romantic tensions being ruled out and therefore concluded due to his old man status. Obviously, the episode is focused on an explicit level, mainly around the discomfort they both feel around their now much larger age difference and the effects this has on their dynamic as friends. However, this conflict is played as almost parallel with the personality changes the Doctor underwent during his regeneration, in a way which to me can only indicate that the writers intended to use 12's autistic behaviour to add to his strangeness and unfamiliarity in the eyes of Clara, and therefore the audience. Watching the episode unfold as an autistic person, I couldn't help but think that Clara's behaviour was very noticeably mirroring the experience of a neurotypical person in a relationship with an autistic person, as the autistic person begins to unmask, challenging the image of them held by their neurotypical friend or partner. This is an issue I've experienced several times in my own life, being treated as unfamiliar and strange after being comfortable enough to stop hyper-monitoring my behaviour, being told I feel like an entirely different person and having people lose interest in me. This story is just as much a character study of both Clara and the Doctor as it is a neutral portrayal of the inevitable issues that occur with unexpected regeneration, and as any vaguely passable story does, is trying to make a point. The emotional conclusion for Clara in this episode is built up gradually, mainly through her conversations with the world's first and only lesbians, Madame Vastra and her wife Jenny, these two characters being the people who help Clara come to terms with and challenge her own aversions to something she sees as strange, is quite significant. Clara is a cis-het white middle-class woman, whereas these bitches, well, one's a lizard and the other's a lizard fucker.
If Vastra changed, if she was different, if she wasn't the person that you liked.
I don't like her, Mom. I love her. And as to different, well, she's a lizard.
Vastra's interactions with Clara across the course of the episode particularly lend credibility to the interpretation of the Doctor's regeneration as a possible analogy for autistic masking. She repeatedly asserts to Clara that the image he presents to her has always been a very deliberate performance, and does so while fully aware of the anger she's going to provoke by calling Clara's relationship with the Doctor into question.
How? He looked young. Who do you think that was for?
Me?
Everyone. I wear a veil as he wore a face. For the same reason.
What reason?
The oldest reason there is for anything. To be accepted.
We can assume that Vastra is very used to people treating her with hostility and subtle bigotry, and we're shown that because of this, she is able to understand and predict Clara's behaviour incredibly easily. Obviously frustrating Clara because no one likes having their own thoughts essentially told to them, especially when trying to deny those thoughts even to oneself. Clara's frustration is necessary for the sake of her growth, however. She is forced to confront the effects her behaviour is having on her best friend, and through Vastra's comparing the Doctor's performance of social acceptability to her own, she is able to show Clara that there are aspects of the Doctor she previously took for granted that are, in fact, a very well-workshopped performance for her sake and for the sake of being accepted. Clara becomes aware that nothing about the Doctor is incidental, and that he has always done far more for her fragile comfort than she could have ever been aware of, and that abandoning him when confronted with his previously unseen complexities is an awful thing to do to someone she still very much loves and cares about. She is wrong according to the moral of the episode, but she is very clearly the character we as an audience are still meant to be sympathizing with. The episode is told from her perspective, thus framing 12 as a weird, uncomfortable stranger, and although this perspective is set up explicitly to be challenged, it very much brings up some issues worth criticizing within the vein of neurodivergent representation. That's right, you thought I was being nice to this show that I love and care about for a second? We're back in complaining mode now, bitch! This story, while theoretically having a positive message on the treatment of neurodivergent people, very much still feels like a neurotypical's guide to tolerance, overly sympathizing and focusing on Clara's feelings with little regard to what the Doctor is experiencing, following her while she has a crisis and her minority friends explain oppression to her. The fact that the Doctor isn't once shown to be bothered by her treatment of him also communicates to neurotypical viewers that a neurodivergent person's experiences do not extend past how they inconvenience their neurotypical peers, and the conflict is only really resolved because another person had to mediate Clara's treatment of him for him. The moral is that even though the Doctor is weirder now, he's still Clara's friend, and it's unfair of her to turn on him. But the show never questions that we as an audience must also find him weird. As far as the episode is concerned, although Clara is wrong for her behavior as a result of him being weird, he is still very much weird, and the audience is not encouraged to challenge themselves further than learning that it's bad to be ableist exclusively through Clara, who is, let's not forget, an allegorical and arguably literal ableist here. The Doctor's strangeness is played as a joke by being contrasted against Clara's normalness, still presented to us as an object of ridicule surrounded by neurotypical straight men for us to laugh at him with, and things like his discomfort with being touched and his struggles with expressing his emotions are constantly belittled and framed as quirky character traits. His neurodivergence is absolutely exclusively presented to the audience as unfamiliar, by way of it always being shown through the perspective of another character. The show assumes an extreme lack of neurodivergence in its own audience, funneling its relatability through these neurotypical straight man sidekicks, yet performatively preaches acceptance through a character it refuses to acknowledge as neurodivergent. In Deep Breath, we follow Clara's emotional journey as she struggles with the experience of having someone she thought she knew become unfamiliar and fail to reciprocate her emotional needs. This is a valid story to tell, and an experience that is definitely relatable to plenty of people, whether read as neurodivergent analogous or not. The issue with this story, however, arises with the fact that the episode seemingly desperately wants to avoid addressing the incredibly widespread and diverse audience inevitably seeing itself on both ends of this conflict. Sure, there will be people watching this episode who exclusively see themselves in Clara, but as I stated earlier, when I was watching, I found the object of relatability to be in the Doctor, and he doesn't even get to react to how she's treating him. Because he's, like, screaming at a dinosaur or throwing a reverse cyborg out of a blimp or whatever. Yeah, this episode actually has a plot. It's not all just Clara's victim complex. I probably would have gouged my eyes out if it was. I completely saw my own experiences with past friendships reflected in the way Clara rejects his strangeness, but found myself starved of compassion for this experience within a narrative that was so convincingly pretending to be on my side. This is an incredibly prominent issue within the world of televised autism representation. Narratives constantly preach that judging or ridiculing us is wrong, but those same narratives are frequently inaccessible to us and difficult to properly see ourselves in, due to them existing only to teach people that aren't us about us. This is the standard for storylines attempting to preach acceptance of the strange and unfamiliar. They constantly fall into the trap of forgetting to be accessible to the people they're trying to be about. Narratives that can help bigoted people recognize and grow from their own biases are absolutely a positive thing, but those narratives should not also make the groups of people they're allegedly doing a positive representation for also throw up in their mouths. A story about learning to accept someone you think is weird should be affirming and helpful for both the person who sees the weird and for the weird. And if you can only do one of those, please God, make it affirming for the weird. We need narrative sympathy more than Clara fucking Oswald. As much as I've shit on this episode, I do genuinely love it, and despite my criticisms, there is definitely a major part of me that does feel affirmed by the fact that hypothetically Madame Vastra would definitely tell people to leave me alone when I'm nonverbal. More than anything, this video is just a fun analysis exercise for me, and really just a reflection of my own experiences with the episode, which are by no means universal. If you have a completely different interpretation, that's fine. All jokes aside, any experience an individual has with a piece of media is nothing more or less than that, and the beautiful thing about media that millions of people have consumed is that the possible interpretations are endless. Hell, I've talked to plenty of people who passionately theorize that Clara herself is autistic, and that interpretation completely shatters every claim I've made in this video. I just love and care about this series immensely, and I wanted to make a video about one of my favorite episodes, which I hope was at the very least enjoyable, even if you completely disagree with everything I said. Everything except Peter Capaldi being hotter than Matt Smith. That is the only take I will not debate anyone on account of it being objective and irrefutable. Please like and subscribe. I have autism.